Stop acting like you're important in my life, my girlfriend told me while secretly messaging someone beside me. So I nodded calmly, continued listening to her stories, and weeks later when her private conversations appeared in a group chat, she finally understood why I had been quiet. You don't have to come if you don't want to. She said it the way people say things they've already decided, flat, rehearsed, like the sentence had been sitting on her tongue for a while, and she finally just let it fall. I looked at her. She wasn't looking back. Her eyes were on her phone, fingers moving fast, the corner of her mouth doing that thing it does, the tiny upward curl, the kind that only shows up when she's talking to someone who actually interests her. I was sitting right beside her, on the same couch, in the same apartment I paid rent for, and she was smiling at a screen like I wasn't even in the room. I asked her who she was texting. She tilted the phone slightly away from me, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough, and said, "Nobody, just a friend." And I nodded. That word, nobody. I filed it somewhere quiet in the back of my mind and left it there. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 26. Vanessa and I had been together for 2.5 years. We lived together in a one-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city where the winters are long and the coffee shops close too early, and most of our relationship had been built on small routines. Her making tea while I cooked, me falling asleep to her reading out loud from whatever novel she was cycling through that month. It had been good for a long time. That's the thing nobody tells you about a relationship falling apart. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up with a warning label. It just starts introducing small moments that feel slightly off, like a single tile on a floor that doesn't quite sit flush with the rest. You notice it. You step over it a few times. And then one day you realize every tile in the room is crooked, and you've been pretending the floor was level this whole time. The first real crack came in early November. We'd gone to her friend Brooke's birthday dinner, a group of 9 people at a restaurant with low lighting and overpriced pasta. I sat next to Vanessa. I always sat next to Vanessa at group dinners. Not because I was clingy or needed constant proximity, but because that's just what you do when you're with your person. You sit next to them. She didn't look at me once during dinner. Not once. The entire meal, 2 hours, wine, appetizers, entrees, dessert nobody finished. She faced the other direction, laughing at things the guy across from her was saying. Someone named Cole who I'd met twice before, a friend of Brooke's boyfriend who always seemed to have too much to say and said all of it with his chest. I ate my food. I answered the questions people directed at me. I watched the way she leaned slightly toward Cole's side of the table whenever he said something, like she was being pulled by a current she wasn't bothering to resist. In the car on the way home, I asked her if everything was okay. She said, "Why wouldn't it be?" I said I just wanted to check. She said, "You always do this." I asked what this was. She turned toward the window and said, "Make things weird when nothing is weird." And I let it go. I let it go because I loved her, and because I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt, and because sometimes you tell yourself a story just long enough to get through the night. 2 weeks after that dinner, I was sitting with her on the couch again. This had become our nightly routine. Her scrolling her phone, me watching something neither of us were really paying attention to, the television filling the silence that had started growing between us like mold behind a wall. She was laughing at something. Softly, to herself, the kind of laugh you don't share, the kind you almost hide. I asked her what was funny. She glanced at me sideways and said, "You wouldn't get it." I said, "Try me." She turned the phone over in her lap, screen down, and said, "It's just an inside joke. Don't worry about it." I looked at her for a second. She looked back. And then the moment passed the way moments do when neither person wants to detonate what's sitting underneath them. She turned the phone back over and kept scrolling. I kept watching the TV. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision so quiet I almost didn't notice I'd made it. I decided to stop asking questions. Not because I'd given up. Not because I didn't care. But because I'd started to understand that some truths don't come when you chase them. They come when you stop running and let them catch up to you. I need to tell you about the moment the story really started. Not the dinner. Not the sideways phone. The moment everything shifted in a direction I couldn't come back from. It was a Saturday afternoon in late November. We were at a coffee shop near our apartment. The one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who always spelled my order wrong on the cup. Vanessa was talking. She'd been talking for almost 40 minutes straight. About work. About something her colleague did that bothered her. About a podcast she'd been listening to. About a restaurant she wanted to try. I was listening. I was genuinely listening, the way I always did, nodding at the right parts, asking follow-up questions, laughing at the parts meant to be funny. That's something people who knew me well understood. I was a good listener. I didn't interrupt. I didn't redirect. I gave whoever I was talking to my full, actual attention. Vanessa knew this about me. Or she used to. She had her phone on the table. At some point, right in the middle of a sentence about the restaurant, it buzzed. She picked it up, glanced at it, and her whole face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it looks in movies. Just a shift. Subtle and quick, like a light changing behind a window. She put the phone face down, looked up at me, and said, "Sorry, what was I saying?" I told her she was talking about the Thai place on Clement Street. She nodded and kept going. But a minute later she picked the phone back up. And then again a minute after that. And each time she looked at the screen, there was that curl at the corner of her mouth. That private, almost imperceptible smile. I watched it happen 3 more times. And then I stopped watching and just sat there, listening to her talk. This woman I had built a life with, who was smiling at someone else's words while I sat right across from her giving her mine. And then she said it. She was mid-sentence about something, I don't even remember what, and I had shifted slightly in my seat. Maybe I had reached toward my coffee, maybe some movement of mine felt too close to her phone, I'm not sure. But she looked up at me with a kind of tired impatience in her eyes and said, "Can you stop hovering?" I hadn't been hovering. I was sitting in my chair. I told her I wasn't. She exhaled, this short, clipped breath, and said, "You know what your problem is?" I waited. She said, "You act like you're more important in my life than you actually are." The coffee shop kept going around me. Someone ordered an oat latte. A child near the window dropped a napkin. The barista called out a name that wasn't mine. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. And she looked back at me for exactly 2 seconds before her phone buzzed again. And she reached for it again. And she smiled again. And the world continued turning like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that doesn't unhappen. I went quiet after that. Not dramatically. Not in the way where you stop answering calls or start slamming doors. Just quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone leaves and doesn't come back. She kept talking to me. About her day. About things that annoyed her. About plans she wanted to make. About shows she was watching. And I kept listening. That's the part people misunderstand when I tell this story later. I didn't become cold. I didn't become distant or sulky or passive-aggressive. I was just present. Completely, quietly present. I listened to every story she told me. I responded when she asked me things. I made coffee in the mornings and left it on the counter for her. I held the elevator. I turned the thermostat to the temperature she preferred. But I stopped offering. I stopped reaching. I stopped being the one who filled every silence, who texted first, who said, "I love you," before she had a chance to not say it back. I became a very still kind of quiet. And here's what's interesting, she didn't notice. Not at first. Because when you've been treating someone like background noise for long enough, their silence sounds exactly like their usual sound. It was during this quiet stretch that I started paying closer attention. Not in a paranoid way, not obsessively, but in the way you start noticing your surroundings once you've decided to actually look instead of just assuming. I noticed she started going to bed later. After I was already asleep, she'd be in the living room with the light low and her phone brightness up, and sometimes I'd hear her laughing from the other room. This real, unguarded laugh, the kind she used to aim at me. I noticed she started keeping her phone face down on every surface. The nightstand, the kitchen counter, the bathroom sink. Always face down. Always. I noticed she started volunteering information I hadn't asked for. "I'm just going to Brooks for a few hours. Cole was at the gym today. Apparently he's training for something. That thing from work got sorted. Not a big deal." Unsolicited explanations. Little sentences dropped into conversation like someone who knows they're being watched, but is trying to look like they don't know. I noticed she'd become more irritable with me in specific ways. The ways that people become irritable when their guilt has nowhere to go and it starts coming out sideways. Short answers. Eye rolls she didn't bother hiding. Small corrections. "You always do that. You never remember anything. You're being sensitive again." I absorbed all of it. I didn't argue back. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded, calmly, and went back to being quiet. Because I understood something that took me a while to articulate clearly, but once I did, it settled into me like a stone dropping into still water. I understood that she wasn't unhappy because of something I was doing. She was unhappy because of something she was doing, and I was the nearest available target for the overflow. That's a very specific kind of unhappiness. And it only resolves one way. My friend Owen called me the first week of December. Owen and I had been close since university. The kind of friend you call when something serious happens, because he's the kind of person who doesn't try to fix what you're saying, he just lets you say it. He asked how I was doing. I told him honestly. I told him about the coffee shop, about the sentence she said, about the phone always face down, about the name Cole appearing in conversations it didn't need to appear in. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to understand the full picture before I make any decisions." He said, "That's fair." And then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "You know what I've noticed about you? You're the kind of person who needs to be completely certain before you act. You'd rather wait and know than move and guess." I said that was probably accurate. He said, "That's not a weakness, man. But don't wait so long that you lose yourself in the process." I told him I wouldn't. I didn't know then whether that was true, but I told him anyway. I should tell you something about Vanessa that I think is important for this to make full sense. She was not a cruel person by nature. That matters. I've thought about this a lot since everything happened, and I keep coming back to it. She wasn't someone who set out to hurt people. She was someone who got tangled in something and didn't know how to get out. And instead of being honest about it, she started managing the situation. And when you manage a situation, you end up managing people. And the people who love you most are usually the easiest ones to manage, because they want to believe you, because they're invested, because they're not looking for reasons to doubt you. I had not been looking for reasons to doubt her. I had been the opposite of that for a long time, looking for reasons to trust. But the problem with that particular optimism, the kind rooted in love rather than evidence, is that it has a threshold. And somewhere between the birthday dinner and the coffee shop, something in me had crossed it. Not with anger, not with certainty, just with a quiet shift in how I was listening. I started listening to the gaps, to what wasn't being said, to the way certain names appeared in certain contexts, to the way her irritability had a pattern if you knew where to look. I had always been good at patterns. She knew that about me too. She just forgot it somewhere along the way. People often forget the most important things about the people standing closest to them. I remembered everything. I remembered the way she used to put her phone face up on every surface like it never crossed her mind to hide it. I remembered how she used to turn the screen toward me and say, "Look at this," about something funny, something infuriating, something random from her day. I remembered how she used to fall asleep mid-conversation when we were on the couch, just let her head tilt sideways into my shoulder without any self-consciousness, without any performance, just ease. That ease was gone, and its absence told a story that none of her words were telling. There is something deeply disorienting about loving someone and watching them disappear in real time. Not physically. They're still right there, same apartment, same couch, same side of the bed. But something behind their eyes is elsewhere. And you keep reaching for the person you fell in love with, and your hands find someone who looks exactly like them, sounds exactly like them, occupies the same space, but is aimed at something you can't see from where you're standing. I had been reaching for a while. I didn't let myself say it directly for a long time. But the reaching had stopped being returned, and at some point, keeping your hand extended stopped feeling like hope and started feeling like something worse. Like stubbornness. Like an insistence on a story that had already ended. I retracted my hand. Quietly. Without announcement. And she didn't notice. That told me everything I needed to know about how much space I had left in the version of her life she was currently living. Christmas was approaching. The apartment had a tree because Vanessa loved Christmas decorations, and I'd bought a small one from a corner stand 3 weeks earlier and set it up without being asked. She'd seemed touched by it at the time. She'd wrapped her arms around me from behind while I was hanging an ornament and said, "You're so thoughtful." 2 days after that, she told me to stop acting like I was more important in her life than I was. I thought about that a lot. The way warmth and cruelty can exist in the same person, sometimes within the same week. The tree was still up, lights blinking on a 2-second cycle. She was on the couch talking to me about a gift she wanted to buy for her mother. I was listening, genuinely, and my phone was face up on the coffee table, notifications visible, nothing hidden, the same way it had always been. I thought about showing her the contrast. I thought about pointing at my phone, then at hers, then asking the simple question. But I didn't, because I already knew the answer wouldn't be honest. And I had stopped needing her answers. I had started looking elsewhere. Here's what I know about group chats. They're messy. They're alive in a way individual conversations aren't. They have their own logic, their own inside language, their own accidental honesty. And Vanessa was in a lot of them. Brooke's friend group, the work chat, a neighborhood app chat, a college friend's chat she'd mentioned but never shown me. I knew all of this in the peripheral, background way you know things about a person you share a life with. I wasn't in any of her chats. That was normal. You don't share every group chat with your partner. But here's what I also knew. Some of the people in those chats were people I also knew. Not well, not closely, but enough. Enough that we had a mutual connection, a shared thread in the web. One of those people was Nate. Nate was the boyfriend of Brooke. Nate worked with someone from my old job, a guy named Felix who I'd stayed in loose contact with. The kind of contact where you like each other's posts and occasionally text about football scores. This is important. Not because I orchestrated anything. Because I didn't. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What happened next was not something I planned, engineered, or set in motion. It was just the natural consequence of certain things existing in the same universe at the same time. It started with a work holiday party. Vanessa's office had their annual gathering, a rooftop venue, open bar, the whole thing. She invited me. I said I'd go. We got dressed up. She looked beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the kind of beautiful that hurts a little when things are already broken because you remember what it felt like to look at her before everything complicated itself. We went. For the first hour, things were fine. Normal. She introduced me to colleagues. I made conversation. We stood together near the bar, and she laughed at something I said, and it felt almost like before. Almost. Then Cole showed up. He wasn't her work colleague. He was the +1 of her colleague, invited through some chain of connection that apparently made his presence here entirely reasonable. I watched her face when she saw him. I had become very good at watching faces. There was a fraction of a second, faster than most people would catch, where her expression changed. Not into something obvious, just into something bright, lit from inside, the way a lamp looks when someone flicks the switch. She covered it quickly. She was good at covering things. But I had been watching closely for weeks by then. I saw it. The rest of the party passed in a quiet film around me. She didn't do anything obviously wrong. She didn't disappear with him, didn't spend the whole night at his side. She stayed near me for most of it. But every time Cole passed within speaking distance, she found a way to include him in the conversation. And every time I needed to step away, to use the bathroom, to get a drink, I noticed that the two of them were always within orbit of each other when I came back. Not close, not provocative, just consistently proximate. On the cab ride home, she was quiet. Not upset quiet. Thoughtful quiet. The kind of quiet that's full of something. I didn't feel it. I looked out the window. I watched the city lights smear past in the rain. And I thought about Owen's words. Don't wait so long that you lose yourself in the process. After the party, something changed. Not in me. In her. She became, I can only describe it as slightly too comfortable. Like someone who has been carrying a secret for a while and the weight of it has started feeling normal, and normal starts feeling like freedom. She started being on her phone more openly, still tilting it away, still keeping it face down when she said it somewhere, but texting more frequently, laughing more freely at whatever was on the screen. She started mentioning Cole in conversation with less effort to explain why she was mentioning him. Cole thinks the new bar on 5th is overrated. Cole was saying something about that documentary. Cole has this whole theory about. Each time, she'd catch herself mid-sentence, glance at me, and then finish in a way that was slightly more casual than the beginning. I would nod. I would respond normally. I never flinched. I think that confused her, actually. She expected something from me. A reaction, a question, a confrontation, something she could dismiss or push back on. And I gave her nothing to push against. Because I had decided I was done being the thing she tested her limits on. I was done being the person she practiced her cruelty toward while saving her softness for someone who hadn't earned it yet. I was done. I just hadn't moved yet. The second week of December, something happened that I didn't expect. It arrived not as a confrontation or a discovery, but as an accident. A small, digital accident that unspooled everything Vanessa had been so carefully keeping wound tight. Here's how it happened. Nate, Brooke's boyfriend, the one connected to Felix from my old job, had a habit of managing too many conversations at once. He ran a group chat for their friend circle, maybe 15 people, called something generic like weekend plans, the kind of chat that starts for one purpose and ends up being everything. Vanessa was in this chat. So was Brooke. So was Cole. So were several others. I was not in this chat. But Felix, who Nate worked with, was loosely connected to a separate chat that included some of the same people, because at some point during a mutual event months back, a wider group chat had been created that nobody fully remembered agreeing to join. The kind of chat that has 60 members and pings twice a year. Nate, managing all these conversations simultaneously on a Saturday evening, made a mistake. The kind of mistake that happens to everyone at some point when you're half paying attention. He meant to send something to a private message. He sent it to the wrong group. The wider, mostly dormant group. The one with 60 people. The one that included Felix. The one that Felix would screenshot and send to me because he thought it was funny and had absolutely no idea it involved anyone I knew. I remember exactly where I was when Felix's message came through. I was standing in the kitchen, reheating soup, Vanessa in the other room. Felix sent me a screenshot with the caption, "LMAO people need to learn how to use their phones." I looked at the screenshot. It wasn't a single message. It was a small cluster of them. Nate had accidentally forwarded not just one message, but a short thread from the other chat. A few exchanges that had been copied and pasted wrong into the wrong window. 3 messages from Qley. 2 from Vanessa. I stood over the soup I wasn't going to eat. I read them. I read them twice. And then I set my phone face down on the counter, the way she always set hers, and I just stood there for a moment, breathing. I'm not going to tell you exactly what those messages said, not because I want to protect her, but because the exact words matter less than what they meant, and what they meant was not ambiguous. What they meant was this. Whatever she and Qley were doing, it wasn't new. It had been going on longer than the birthday dinner, longer than the coffee shop, longer than the face-down phone and the unsolicited explanations, and the "you act like you're more important than you are." Those messages had the shorthand of people who'd been talking in a certain way for a while. Nicknames, references to places. One line from her that said something like, "You know he'd never understand this about you," the he being, without any question, me. I stood in the kitchen until the soup started to bubble over the edge of the pot. I turned off the stove. I picked up my phone. I saved the screenshot somewhere private. And then I put my phone in my pocket, walked into the living room, sat down next to Vanessa, and asked her how her day had been. She looked at me, slightly surprised by the direct question, maybe expecting the quiet version of me she'd gotten used to. She said, "Fine. Boring." "What?" I said, "Just asking." She said, "Okay," and went back to her show. I watched the television and felt nothing at all, which, I would later understand, is what happens when the last strand finally goes. Not a snap, but a release. A quiet, clean, complete release. I spent 3 days with that screenshot. 3 days of completely normal behavior. Making coffee, listening to her stories, nodding at the right parts, saying good morning and good night. 3 days of being the person I had always been in this relationship, while she had no idea that the floor had finally given way beneath us. I called Owen on day 2. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Nothing. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who isn't her." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I actually am." And that was the strange thing. The thing I hadn't expected. I was okay. Not the fake okay you perform for other people. Genuinely okay in the way that comes not from happiness, but from clarity. From finally knowing what you already knew. From no longer having to hold a question that you suspected the answer to but couldn't prove. The question had answered itself. And I had found a kind of still, cold freedom in that. He asked me what I was going to do with the information. I told him I was going to use it the same way you use a key that you've been looking for a long time. Not to break anything, just to open what had already been locked. He said, "You've been holding this whole thing so carefully." I said I had to. If I'd reacted in the middle of it, without the full picture, it would have become about my reaction instead of about what actually happened. He said, "Yeah." I said, "I've watched enough of these situations end badly because someone moved too fast, said too much, gave the other person something to fight against instead of something to reckon with." He said, "And you wanted her to reckon with it." I said, "I wanted the truth to have space to land, without noise around it." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's either very wise or very exhausting." I said it was both. On the 3rd night, I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Not dramatically. I'd made dinner. Pasta, simple, something I made often. We ate, and after the plates were cleared, I asked her to stay at the table for a minute because I wanted to talk. She looked at me with a slight wariness that told me some part of her had been waiting for this. Maybe longer than I had. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to actually think before you answer." She said, "Okay." I said, "How are things between us?" She blinked. She'd expected something else, maybe a direct accusation, maybe a confrontation with evidence, maybe anger. Not a question. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, I mean exactly what I asked. How are things between us? In your honest opinion. She looked at the table. She turned her fork over once. She said, I think we've been distant lately. I said, okay. Whose distance? She looked up. She said, both of ours. I nodded slowly. I said, I've been quiet. That's true. But I've still been here. I've been listening to your stories every day. I've been present. I've been taking care of things. I've been doing all the things I always did. She said, I know. I said, so what changed? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said, I don't know what you want me to say. I said, I don't want you to say anything in particular. I want you to say the true thing. She looked at me for a long time, and I sat across from her in the quiet kitchen, under the small ceiling light, completely still, completely patient, waiting. She started talking, not about Qley, not directly. She started talking in the circling way people do when they're approaching something they aren't ready to name. She said things had felt heavy lately. She said she'd been feeling like she was missing something she couldn't identify. She said she hadn't meant to pull away. It had just happened. She said sometimes she felt like she and I had become a habit more than a choice. I listened to all of it. I let her talk for almost 20 minutes, filling the space, building toward whatever she was actually trying to say. And when she seemed to run out of steam, I said, I want to show you something. I took out my phone. I opened the screenshot Felix had sent me. I placed the phone on the table between us. I didn't say anything. I just let her look at it. I watched her face. I watched it go through 3 distinct stages. First, recognition. The instant, involuntary recognition of your own words in a place they were never supposed to be. Second, a kind of rapid calculation, her eyes moving fast, processing, measuring. Third, something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not deflection, not the prepared lie. Just stillness. The same kind of stillness I had been carrying for weeks. Like she had borrowed it from me in the very moment I was setting it down. She said, where did you get this? I told her it had come to me by accident, through a mutual connection, forwarded from the wrong chat. I told her I wasn't looking for it. I told her it found me. She said, how long have you had this? I said, 3 days. She looked at me. She said, and you just sat on it for 3 days? I said, I needed to be sure about how I felt before I brought it to you. She said, how you felt? I said, yes. She was quiet. Then she said, and how do you feel? I looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had sat beside me on that couch, who had made tea while I cooked, who I had fallen asleep next to and woken up next to and built a small, ordinary, precious life beside. I said, like I've been watching a door close for months, and I finally saw it lock. She looked at the table. She said, quietly, I didn't mean for it to become what it became. I said, I believe you. She looked up, surprised. I said, I also believe that it became what it became, regardless of what you meant. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. And then neither of us said anything for a while. I need to talk about what she said next, because it reframed something for me. After the silence stretched long enough to become something solid, she said, you knew before the screenshot, didn't you? It wasn't really a question. I said, I had a strong feeling, yes. She said, and you just kept listening to my stories. I said, yes. She said, why? I thought about it. I said, because I was giving you time to be honest with me, and because I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing before I decided what to do with it. She said, and that day in the coffee shop. I said, what about it? She said, when I said what I said. I said, yeah. She closed her eyes for a moment. She said, I said it because I was already feeling guilty and I was looking for a way to make it your fault somehow. And that was wrong. That was really wrong. I said, I know why you said it. She said, it wasn't true. I said, I know that too. She said, you didn't react. At the time, you just nodded. I said, because I was done reacting to things designed to provoke me. I decided that if there was something real to address, I'd address it when I had the full picture. She said, that's terrifying, you know. I said, what is? She said, how calm you can be. I said, I've always been calm. She said, I know. I just stopped noticing. That sentence sat between us for a long time. I've thought about it often since. Not with bitterness, but with the quiet recognition of how easily the most important things about a person can go invisible when someone decides, consciously or not, to stop looking. The conversation lasted 2 more hours. Some of it I'll keep private, not because it's too painful, but because it belongs to both of us and some things should stay between the people who lived through them. What I can tell you is this. She didn't minimize it. Once the screenshot was on the table and the circling was over, she was honest. She told me it had started as messages. She and Cole had a connection she couldn't explain, that they talked in a way she hadn't talked to anyone in a long time. She said it hadn't become anything physical. She said that like it should soften something. I told her that what it had become was enough. That the secrecy was enough. That the face-down phones and the tilted screens and the you wouldn't get it and the stop acting like you're important, those were enough. She didn't argue with that. She just nodded. And then she said, I think I've been really unhappy for a while and I handled it in the worst possible way. I said, you could have talked to me. She said, I know. I said, we could have worked on it. Or we could have ended it cleanly. Either way would have been better than this. She said, I know. I said, but you didn't. And now here we are. She said, here we are. I want to be honest about what came after. Because I think there's a version of this story where I walk away looking entirely righteous, entirely composed, entirely unaffected. And that version would be a lie. The night after that conversation, once she had gone to the guest room and the apartment was mine to walk through alone, I stood in the kitchen and felt all of it. Every bit. The weight of 2.5 years. The specific grief of loving someone who had decided, quietly, incrementally, without telling you, to stop choosing you. The strange loneliness of having been so perceptive, so patient, so calm, and still arriving at the same destination as if none of that had mattered. I didn't call Owen. I didn't text anyone. I just stood in the kitchen for a while in the dark, and then I went to bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let myself feel it. All of it. Because I think there's a dignity in that. In feeling the full weight of a thing without running from it. In not pretending you're fine before you actually are. I cried once. Briefly. Not out of devastation. Out of something more like release. Like finally exhaling after holding your breath for an entire season. We separated 3 weeks later. It was civil. More civil than I expected, honestly, given everything. She found a place, moved in with Brooke temporarily while she sorted something longer term. We divided things without drama. No lawyers, no screaming, no final word cruelty. She took her books. I kept the coffee maker. She took the throw blankets. I kept the bad art print we'd bought at a market that neither of us particularly liked, but both somehow felt attached to. The morning after we divided things, and it was clear what belonged to whom, and what the next few weeks would look like, we had one last cup of coffee together at the kitchen table. Not planned. Just, both of us awake early, both reaching for the same pot. We sat across from each other the way we had on that final night, and we drank our coffee without saying much. It wasn't sad exactly. It was just present. Two people acknowledging that something real had existed here, and something real had ended here, and there was no way to make that feel light. She put down her cup at some point and said, I keep thinking about how long you were listening to me talk every day, even while all of this was happening. I said, that's who I am. She said, I know. I should have appreciated it more. I said, you should have. She looked down at her coffee. She said, were you listening because you still cared, or because you were watching for something? I thought about it genuinely before I answered. I said both, at the same time, and I don't think that's a contradiction. She nodded slowly. She said, that makes sense. She looked at me one more time across the table, not with longing, not with regret exactly, but with something that looked like recognition. The same recognition you get when you finally understand what someone was doing while you were watching them and wondering. She said, you were always going to be okay, weren't you? It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to admiration and sadness occupying the same sentence. I thought about it honestly. I said, I think so. Yeah, she said. I think that's what scared me, actually. You were always so together. I kept waiting for you to fall apart about something, and you never did. I said, falling apart doesn't mean you care more. She said, I know that now. I said, some people are just quieter about it. She nodded, and then we finished our coffee. On the last day, when she was taking the final boxes, she stopped at the door. She said, I know I don't have the right to ask for this, but I want to say I'm sorry. Not the night of the screenshot sorry. I mean for all of it. For making you feel invisible. For a long time. I said, I know. She said, you deserved better than what I gave you. I said, yeah, I did. She nodded. She said, I hope you know that. I said, I do now. She left. The door closed. The apartment was quiet. The Christmas tree was still in the corner, lights still blinking on their 2-second cycle. I sat down on the couch, looked at the tree for a while, and felt something unfamiliar. Not emptiness. Not grief. Something lighter. Something that, after a few minutes, I recognized as space. Wide, honest, uncontested space. Just mine. Here's what I know now that I didn't fully know then. Calmness is not the same thing as passivity. Listening is not the same thing as accepting. Being quiet is not the same thing as not knowing. I stayed quiet through all of it, not because I was afraid of the confrontation, but because I refused to act on incomplete information, because I needed to be sure, because I had learned somewhere along the way that how you move matters as much as what you're moving toward. And when I finally moved, I moved from a place of complete clarity. No anger, no revenge, no performance, just the clean, simple truth laid on a kitchen table between two people who had run out of ways to pretend. The last thing I want to tell you is about a conversation I had with Owen about a month after she moved out. We met for coffee, a different place, not the one near my apartment, somewhere new. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was good. Actually good. He asked what I'd learned from all of it. I thought about it for a minute. I said, I learned that when someone tells you that you're not important in their life, the right response isn't to argue with them. He said, what is the right response? I said, to believe them, and then to decide whether that's a place you want to keep living. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and you decided. I said, eventually. Yeah. He said, you okay with how it ended? I looked out the window at the street, at the city moving past in its usual indifferent rhythm. I said, it ended the only way it could. She made choices. I made choices. And the truth had its own way of arriving when it was ready. He said, that's very calm of you. I said, I've been practicing. He laughed. I laughed. And we sat there drinking our coffee, the winter outside finally starting to ease, some small suggestion of warmth beginning its way back into the world. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan for the months ahead, no mapped out idea of what the next version of my life looked like. And for the first time in a long time, I found that I was okay with that, with not knowing, with being inside the open space instead of trying to fill it. Owen looked at me at some point and said, you seem lighter. I thought about that word, lighter. I said, I think I am. He said, good. And that was it. No big speech, no dramatic conclusion, just two people finishing coffee on a winter morning, one of them a little less burdened than he'd been the last time they sat together. Sometimes that's exactly what recovery looks like. Not a transformation, not a triumph, just lighter. There is a version of loss that doesn't leave you hollow. It leaves you open instead. And I had started to understand that I was only standing in the open because something had finally cleared away, something that had been taking up a lot of space and a lot of light and a lot of my quiet attention for a long time. I thought about the man I'd been for those last several months of that relationship. The one who made coffee in the mornings and set up Christmas trees and sat next to his person at every table and gave every story his full, complete, undivided attention. That man had not diminished. He had simply been poured into a space that had stopped being able to hold him. And now that space had emptied, and he was still standing. I also thought about what it cost to stay quiet when every instinct is telling you to confront. Because people misunderstand that part. They think the silence was easy. They think the nodding was easy. They think listening, genuinely, fully, day after day, to stories from someone who had already half decided to leave is something you do without effort. It isn't. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. Not because of the pretending, but because there's no pretending involved. When I listened, I was actually listening. When I responded, I was actually there. The tragedy of it, the part that took me a while to sit with, is that my presence was completely real and hers was already somewhere else. And I kept showing up anyway, because that's what I believed a relationship deserved. And when it turned out the relationship had already quietly ended without my consent, I at least knew I had shown up for it completely until the very last moment. That matters to me, more than I expected it to. I think about that sentence sometimes. Stop acting like you're more important in my life than you actually are. I think about who I was in the moment she said it. A man who had just spent 40 minutes listening to every word she said. A man who made coffee before she asked, who set up a Christmas tree because she loved them, who sat next to her at every dinner because that's where people who love each other sit. A man who woke up early and stayed up late and remembered the small things and gave the full things and showed up every single day without being asked to. A man who, in the very moment she dismissed him, was more present and more attentive than the person she was secretly smiling at on her phone would ever have the chance to be. That man was not unimportant. He was just loving someone who had stopped being able to see clearly. And when the fog finally lifted, When those messages landed in the wrong group, in the wrong chat, and found their way to a kitchen table in a small apartment with a blinking Christmas tree, she finally understood why he'd been so quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, because he had already said everything worth saying 100 times over. In the coffee he made every morning, in the tree he bought without being asked, in the stories he listened to without interrupting, in the seat he took beside her at every table, in the 2 years and more of unbroken, unannounced, unreceived presence. He had said it all, in the only language he knew how to speak, and he was waiting, patiently, for the moment truth would say the rest.